Aloha Mai 300. We are incredibly honored to have our sixth and final guest lecture in this course, or I guess we should say talk story session, because that's been more and more how it's been emerging, with Dr. Nandi Odhiambo. Dr. Odhiambo teaches creative writing and English literature courses at West Oahu, but he's also a very skillful and expert writer, and has been writing for a very long time. And is going to be talking to us about his book, Smells Like Stars, a little bit about his writing process, and then maybe even talking more about the whole creative writing and thinking about stories, since we're working on that for our podcast episodes, putting together, strategically thinking about language. And as you could tell in the chapter that you read from him, that is what it's all about, right? Your strategic choices and the way you're framing things can really bring out a topic or a character or a purpose or a point. And so I want to open this up to Dr. Odhiambo. Thank you for joining us. And could you tell us a bit about yourself, like some of your background and what has led you to this point in your life and career?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. Really appreciate it. And I really enjoy the opportunity to actually talk about writing, and somehow through talking about it, make sense of what it has meant. Because I grew up in Kenya. I was born in Nairobi in 1965, so the 60s. And I left when I was quite young. I went to a boarding school in Winnipeg in Canada when I was 12. And so since that point, I've been living in different places. I lived in different places in Canada for a while, and then I moved to the States in 2000. And I was on the East Coast in Massachusetts and Philadelphia before moving here to Hawaii. And to me, that movement is a little bit unstabilizing. With each place that I've gone to, it's almost as if I've had to learn how to make sense of a place that I had no past footing in. So when I moved to Winnipeg, for instance, I had never heard of the National Hockey League. But that hockey was such a big part of the culture, and knowing who the heroes were and the teams. And so I was outside of a lot of things that were essential to that place. And I think I found that at some point I started to write. And that was my way of making sense of the movement. And so I started writing when I was in university, and I was at university in Montreal, and I started to write poetry. And that was at first something that was really exciting, because it was, things were coming out of me that I didn't really recognize, but that I really liked, and I look back on some of that stuff and it's really embarrassing and awful, but at the time it felt, it was just there's something magical that I could alchemically change an experience into language that wasn't just a kind of reproduction, a description, but that captured something about the moment and the time and the feeling. And so I guess I've been, since then, writing different things, evolving. I wrote a play was the first big thing that I wrote. And then I moved to focusing on fiction. And I've written 4 novels now. And the last 2 I actually wrote when I was in Hawaii. So I think, and I continue to write. I also wrote a book of philosophy and literary criticism that came out last year. So I'm interested I've been interested in taking how I've been making sense of this journey through all these different places and all these different experiences, in different genres and in different ways of speaking about those experiences.
That's really cool. And I didn't know about all the different movement that you've been through. I like this focus that you're talking about on movement and trying to make sense of that movement. Um, and so I guess movement through those different places kind of relates to how we're talking about in humanities contact zones and how people have to navigate different contact zones where cultures, perspectives, and ideologies clash. And like what I'm thinking about is like when you were in this place where the culture was very about hockey or something, and you didn't have, maybe potentially didn't have an entry point right away. Trying to make sense of that and why you don't have the entry point is a really interesting question, I think. Could you describe potentially like the contact zones that you navigate in your current writing project, like your most recent, like the one that you shared with us with Smells Like Stars? And you can also even speak to your book of philosophy and literary criticism.
Well, I think that the those last two projects are linked. Um, so there is a side of me that is purely thinking aesthetically when I'm writing, and so that's the creative work. And then there's a part of me that's also working out concepts and ideas. And when I research a novel, I am generally reading a lot of philosophy, which is what I did with writing Smells Like Stars. Ended up reading a lot of Gilles Deleuze, and started to develop a real love for Martin Heidegger's work. So what I found is that both of those projects drill down on the idea of thinking. What does it mean to think? And what I've been noting and finding is that there is we for instance teach in the humanities, and so we're in an environment where there are different disciplines, some in the sciences, some in the social sciences, and others in the humanities. And what I have been getting more recently in sort of thinking about all of that is the way in which these specific disciplines are, as Martin Heidegger would put it, are different domains of thought. And so what can happen is that instead of looking at different domains as thought belonging to a contact zone where they relate and engage with one another, there can be an emphasis on putting down things that aren't your own. So, for instance, there's an idea that the sciences tell us what is truthful and correct about what it means to be alive, right? And so one will value that over the arts. But I think that it's important to remember that these things within this contact zone belong to different domains of thought that show us specific ways of being in the world and how to engage with the world. And they're useful in their own ways. So if I break my leg, I'm probably going to go to a medical doctor. And I think that as now I'm dealing with some things with my aging parents, and I'm trying to find meaning there. Where I go is the arts. I read literature. I drop into philosophy, and one thing that that term, the humanities, it's a Latin word for kind of kindness, but I like to think of it in terms of care. That it's we are in a domain of thinking that is about care, and we are going before and beneath what things like the sciences do, where they quantify and they talk about the material world. And what we do is we think about the contact zone. We think about how these many different, there are many different elements that are beyond the material that contribute to making what the material is. So I moved around. I think in the end, I'm saying that my books more recently are really working out those ideas. So I'm working out those ideas in the fiction. And what Smells Like Stars, one of the things that's in that book is like different languages. There's Swahili, there is German, there's English, there might be some French thrown in there somewhere, but I'm just trying to get different languages on the page to work with that idea of relating within these different domains of thinking.
That's really interesting. And you talked about having to do research in using the different domains of thinking as part of a way, as a lens, right? Or as a way of working out what you're writing about. Could you talk a bit more about that process of research? Like, is that an expectation of writers, right? To do the research and then write, or is that has that always been your process, or has it changed over time? I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, that does make sense. I think there's something very personal. I can only talk about this in a very personal way because there are many different approaches. And I think for the most part, a writer will find the approach that works best for them. And some people come through it from their own experience. That's their starting point. That's their research. They think about their lives. They journal, they write about their life. And that material becomes the project. I think that I am interested in experience because that's actually where it is. With creative writing, I want to talk about what it means to be alive, to exist, and so one of the things that I'm constantly doing is drawing on my own experience, but trying to figure out how I can talk about it in a way that isn't shaped by how others talk about how experience should feel like or should look like. And so the work then has become for me about understanding the tradition, the writing tradition. So for a while, I went back to school at some point and got a PhD where I focused on just reading British fiction from like 17th century to the present day. And I went back even further and looked at like the history of the novel, going back to Don Quixote by Cervantes. And so I was really, I had to understand the history of the novel to be able to figure out how I could be novel the way that I wrote. So that's been ideas. I think the way that literature has been framed, it's a weight. It comes down. There are expectations about how you should write and how you should think about writing, how you should just think. So I've had to go back and really look at how people have thought, particularly in the West where I'm living, and so that I can understand what came before the research, and so that I can actually figure out what my own voice is, my original take is on all of this stuff. So yeah, so in the end, part of my process is that I spend a great deal of time studying. And I think that from very early on, I wanted to write at a high level, which for me has meant that I understood at some point that when I write something and I put it out, I try to get a publisher to take it, that I'm competing with the best writers out there. So I learned about how they lived, how they wrote, how they worked. And I was seeing that, and even the writers, I've studied under some really amazing writers too. And they work incredibly hard. They basically working 6 or 7 days a week on their work. They're putting in the hours, they're studying, they're reading, they're multifaceted in what they know. And so to me, I've been like, if I want to function at that level, I may never really get there because maybe it's an idea in my head that doesn't really exist. But I'm constantly pushing for just being rigorous in my and serious about my research, and serious about how disciplined I am. I protect my time to write. I make sacrifices to do it. I will either get up early to do it, or I will do it late if my days are full and I can't get the time in. So yeah, that is loosely my process.
Thanks for sharing that. And I understand that like you have to protect your time. And I feel like that's really important when thinking about, any sort of project you're creating, because you need to have that time and focus during that time and be able to like you're saying, put in those hours, put in that rigor so that you can write at the level that you want to.
Mhm.
I guess my question for you would be, what are some of the biggest problems or issues that you've had to overcome? I know you're talking about being disciplined. Has there been anything else, like as far as maybe the infamous writer's block? Like, I don't know what to do, or like, what are some of your strategies if you're stuck, for example?
Well, I think it's hard for me to talk about writer's block because I don't have it. I don't have a problem with it, and it's in some level I don't quite understand it, which doesn't mean I'm dismissive of the fact that it exists. I think that for me, the one of the ways I've been able to avoid it is that to me it's all about thinking and a kind of depth of thought. And I can think out on paper. Um, I can think out loud in my conversations. There's nothing that inhibits me from doing that. Um, what can inhibit me is like sometimes I may be too tired. So I don't want to do it. But also there's that, going back to the contact zones, this idea that there is I am in the world as an African, uh, uh, born in Africa, living in the West, um, a male who is trying to deal with the racism, discrimination, violence, lack of safety, lack of nurturing in sort of that writing environment, where there is an expectation that I think in these ways that to me seem very dogmatic and generalized and universal, that are old ways of thinking. And while I'm trying to move into something that feels more connected to my own being in the world, and also how that is sometimes working against belonging to a particular community. So being a Black person doesn't mean that we all think all the same way, feel the same way, have the same. So to me, the challenges end up being on this in this personal, kind of personal realm, where I'm having to do a lot of work to not allow the weight of the history of all of that stuff to rob me of my desire, my belief in myself, my capacity to do the work. And I just try to keep telling myself that I just have to show up. I don't have to be famous. I don't have to be great. Well, actually, I do have to be great, but I don't have to be famous. I just have to show up and work. So, in terms of challenges, I think the big challenges are those un they're not invisible. They're difficult to unpack, but they're those challenges that are dynamics that swirl all around that kind of diminish a capacity or a belief in a capacity to create or to be the person that I want to be. So I think, yeah, I can talk about it in different ways, but in the end, it comes back to that.
That's really important to hear too, that like having to be confident in what you're doing, having to know and situate yourself within the different contact zones that you're working across, and trying to acknowledge the multiple intersections that you're having to tie together or untie. I guess my next question would be like, why are you, so do you feel like it's just this personal aspect that motivates you to write about the things that you write about, or do you feel that there is other factors that weigh in, like what you were saying?
Well, I think that there are, it's kind of a mystery why people are drawn to writing. And for a lot of people, the idea is really based on capitalism, where what you're trying to do is produce a product that makes money in a certain way, that gives you a kind of standing or status in society in a very specific way. And I think that uh, that entire way of thinking has just got us into so much trouble. We start to look at the world as like just this resource, and we don't enjoy nature, but we think of nature as something that is like, as a tourist, we go and see. And so I think that for me, writing has somehow been connected to understanding that I don't accept that. I'm trying to think differently, and there's you don't. No one gives. It's not pre-given. No one can tell you how to think life. It's something that you have to arrive at through moving away from the ways and conventional ways in which we're supposed to think and feel and write and all of that sort of thing. So I think for me, the one of the things that I've learned, and a word that I really love, the Greek word aletheia, which means kind of disclosing, unclosing, and revealing. It's a way of relating to the truth as something that is revealed and disclosed, as opposed to something that's correct, that's a proposition, and that's the way that we tend to think, in these ways of truth as kind of propositions. So I think in the end, I'm saying that the connection for me is just the understanding is that I want to be involved in a kind of revelation and a kind of unconcealing, and the arts, the humanities, gives me that opportunity to do that.
Can I ask how you start? Do you start with, like, was what you were saying earlier, was you were thinking through the different ways of thinking, of domains of thinking, but do you start with like the philosophy aspect, or do you start with like character or plot or other kind of writing moves?
Okay, so I write. I will write in two ways when I'm putting together a project, and one of them is the creative part, which actually always begins with me. Always begins uh, as a relationship to language. So I'm usually starting out by just writing sentences that are interesting sentences. And I think the key here is that I'm trying to find a relationship to words that goes beyond what is just described and represented, but language that works more like poetry, where your senses are evoked, your feeling, so you enter inside. And usually for me, while I am doing that, at first it's very fragmented. But over time, I begin to see voices. Voices as dialogue starts to emerge. I begin to find characters. I find names. I start to give characters names. Everything at first is very rudimentary. It's not very good, but I feel that there's something that's shaping and forming. And all I have to do is keep showing up. So for me, I start with language, and I let the other things emerge. And it has been really important for me to learn the different component parts of creative writing, because you really do need to know how to work with character. Characters can't be flat. They can't be simple. They have to have a kind of a complexity that a reader can relate to, in terms of how human beings aren't just villainous, for instance. They also feel lonely as well. So, I have to learn about character. So while I am in this process of just developing things, I'm also thinking about, okay, at some point I really need to develop my characters. I also think about plot, but there are ways in which plot can be sort of the traditional Freytag pyramid, the Aristotelian triangle, beginning, middle, end. That's a great way to organize how one works with the plotting. But I'm always aware that I'm more interested in allowing the characters to dictate where the story is going. So that also becomes a part of what happens when I'm playing around, which is what is happening. I'm just playing around on the page. And there's things like the importance of detail. That's one of the, it's easy to get into a mode where one can write with creative writing like an essay writer, where you just are kind of summarizing. Yeah, I go back to, while I'm doing this, thinking about the importance of specificity. Not all the time, you got overwhelmed with constant specificity, but I'm constantly going back and forth between these craft elements, understanding them, working with them, while I am building on what started as a play with language.
That's really cool. I feel like I kind of do the same thing. Like I start with different sentences and then they emerge. And then I've also heard of people that go just with plot and they like plan it really finely and then they can write. So I think it's really interesting to emphasize how different the different approaches can be. And so you explained your creative part. You said you had another way, or did I miss that?
Oh,
So
yes.
no, it's okay. I just wanted to make sure I catch on to that.
No, I read. I have this thing where it takes me forever to get through certain books and essays because I read. I do sentence level reading, and I will try and make sure that I fully understand ideas, and I will jot stuff down in the margins while I'm reading the books. And so that's the first thing for me, is like I need to fully understand what I'm reading. I try to be really honest about that, because it's easy to fall into kind of superficiality where it's just that you've read something and you can say I've done it, but I think it's more important to have you really understood it. So I will take the notes that I make in the margins, and then I will write those notes out. And then I will build from my notes to develop my more idea-driven work. And so it's a similar process in terms of working with the kind of fragments, but I usually start with texts and primary texts, my own notes that I get, what I understand from that, and then I begin building from there around what it is that I'm most interested in about the things that I'm collecting, and just allowing a kind of creative process to take over, to allow the ideas to suggest new paths for me, new ways of thinking.
I really like how you capture that, because a lot of the students in this course for their podcast projects, they're going to do interviews, or they're going to do further research, or they're going to go out into locations and most likely take notes in the margins, like you said, and probably have to build based upon those notes, unless they're maybe potentially going to approach it in a different way. But I think that that kind of process is really important to emphasize, in not just that it's less or more like the first process with the fragments, because I feel like that can be a good way to brainstorm and start it, but the reading part is also just as important. And I think that's that. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's really clear what you're doing and how you're putting things together, and I feel like that can resonate with a lot of student projects and stuff right now.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that I've always felt that beneath process is integrity. In the end, it's no matter what the approach one takes, is there an integrity around doing a kind of background work, and also putting in the time and the effort.
Yeah, and I think putting in the time and the effort, making sure you're doing what you need to do to learn as much as you possibly can, is really important, and can create that integrity that makes listeners know, right? As far as in the case of podcasting, know that they should continue listening, or in the case of readers, know that they should continue reading what you're writing. And I think I think integrity is a really important thing, and it relates to a lot of stuff that we're talking about in this course as well. And in the humanities in general, like with capstone projects and everything. I guess my next question would be like, what's been the most difficult or most challenging issue, like part of your writing projects? Like what's been the most challenging thing about Smells Like Stars, for instance? What was something that you had to overcome to write?
It actually there's two things. The first was how I was going to work with language, because one of the things that drives me crazy when I read books is, you'll be reading along and then someone will slip into another language, maybe let's say Swahili, and then there will be like an explanation that comes after the Swahili that says what it is, and then says something like Swahili is a language spoken in East Africa, and then you get back to the story. And I always feel like I moved outside. There's a way in which, and it happens when you work with elements that are foreign to like the West. There's a need to kind of do that short explanation. And so for me, I was like, I understand why that is necessary. And if people want to do it, cool. However, I didn't figure it out. And so what I ended up doing was working with footnotes. And so that I just had the language as you would hear it. So, when we move out into the world, we just hear different language. It's in the atmosphere. So that's how I ended up resolving it for myself, was just allowing it to exist as it might exist in the world, and then work with the footnotes. So that was something that was one thing I really struggled with for a long time, and I still don't know whether it's the best solution. I'm still trying to figure it out. Maybe the key is you just don't even like translate it. You just let the reader go figure it out for themselves. I don't know. The other thing was that it took me forever to get a publisher for it, and I actually had a very early draft of it done way back in 2010, 2011. And I spent a lot of years sending a variety of drafts out to publishing houses. And people just weren't interested in what I was doing. And it was the first time I'd had that kind of resistance in my writing career, that kind of formidable resistance. And I didn't want to quit, but I didn't. I was a point where I wasn't really enjoying it. I wasn't enjoying writing very much because I felt like it doesn't matter what I do. People are coming at the reading in ways that we're missing each other for whatever reason. And I was very clear. I'm not trying to be a braggart about this. I knew what I was doing. I'd worked really hard. I knew what I was doing, and it was so frustrating and so hard. And I was, yeah, I was losing faith in something about the industry, and I began to find it quite superficial, which is something I still think, for the most part. So that was a huge challenge for me, just hanging in there. And eventually, I did find a reader. And that's what people tell you, you'll find your readers eventually. But I also, while I was trying to find my reader, I was listening to things and I was making adjustments to how I was approaching what I was doing. So in the end, the book, which I love, it ends up being somewhat of a compromise in terms of it's not the original draft, how I would have done it. It's something that came out of conversations over years with just different people in the industry to produce that.
Wow, yeah, to know that and that, you won an award for the book is really, really interesting and speaks to the commitment that you keep talking about. And yes, you do know what you're doing. Like that's not bragging. You've been writing, you've been published, and you've done all this different work. And sometimes when you try to push boundaries, I think that's when you can get a lot of resistance. And I like that you're speaking to the whole like this might not be what is marketable. And I think that can echo some of the topics and themes that students have chosen for their podcasts, but they are marketable. They have a reader, and knowing you'll find your readers eventually is a really good statement there, kind of really encouraging in the sense that just have to be very confident in what you're doing. Yes, listen, but also know that you're doing the work if you're putting the work in. So yeah, I didn't know any of that. That's really, I didn't even know you had a draft of that done in 2010 before I even knew you. So that's just awesome. Are you happy with the compromise? Do you feel that it's okay?
Okay, when I was a young writer starting out, I wanted to do it my way. I was like, I wasn't listening to anyone because I believed that art was a kind of documentation. So in order for me to exist in some manner, there had to be something of me that was strictly my own. And so when I first started out, uh, my first book was Disbanded Nation, and it's a very kind of unconventional work. When I when I started out with that, I was just not listening to anyone, and I was just I would be told to do something, and I would go the opposite direction. I think that book is almost a product of that. It's yeah. So I think one thing I learned though was that we're not in the world alone. Like we're in the world with other people, and we can't. At some point, that has to be engaged. And so, as a writer, over time, that's what I've been growing into understanding that I need to have relationships with other people, with other inputs in order to actually do better about articulating what it is that is my own. So I don't lose it. I don't lose my own thing. I think that rather what is added to it is the world in some ways. So yeah, that's what I think with Smells Like Stars. I really love it. I don't compromise to the point where there are fundamental things that I get rid of. And it's all, and at some point, I mean, I was working with an editor who I had a good relationship with. We could talk through things. And I mean, there was one thing there's some cuts that I made. And I made them because I was trying to do this thing where what we do in reality is we grasp with intuitions, and sometimes it's not clear what we're getting, but we're getting some. So there was a kind of imagistic kind of writing in sections, and I had a lot more of that. I cut quite a bit of it, and I wasn't terribly happy about doing it, but I actually think that I just don't want to deal with the bother of having to explain and then be told you don't know what you're doing, you don't know how to write, even though I'm consciously doing that. So yeah, I'm mostly happy. I'm happy with a great deal of it, but there are things about it that I had to let go of, some things.
And I think that's important to emphasize here because students are crafting these podcasts that are kind of like, a story. And I've met with a few groups and they're wanting to do like 3 interviews and integrate them and interweave them. And I'm telling them, no, cut it down. Like do maybe 1 interview. Less is more sometimes. But also, even when you're trying to try something out and seeing if it works or doesn't work, I think is a really good process to go through. And maybe those sections that you've had to cut out will turn into a different project. I guess you never know. But it is good to hear that, everybody, even someone as established as you, has to go back and think through audience and think through what is going to work and what's not going to work, and sometimes having to get rid of, I think it's what Anne Sexton said, like kill your pretty ones. Like you have to get rid of the things that you absolutely love sometimes to continue to, I guess, right, like, reach other people, like what you were saying.
Yeah. And it can feel unpleasant, but I think it's in the end, this is why I mentioned being a braggart. I think it's really important to be humble, and like I don't understand everything. I work hard to understand as much as I can, but it's really important to be able to listen to the voice of experience, and to know when you actually are getting assistance in having what you want to do gain greater coherence.
Yeah, and I guess that brings me to my final question, because we're at 2:50. Like, what advice would you give future humanities majors about navigating contact zones in prospective creating writing projects, or like this course's major assignment, or even their senior capstone courses? Like, what are some writerly tips that you might give the listener or the viewers of this class to sort of to navigate contact zones in a way that is, I guess what you're saying, like attuned to multiple experiences, attuned to a deep, rigorous research process, but also create more, bringing their expertise into it as well?
Yeah, it's tough. I think that I think there's something that fundamentally has to be understood. I think that what is really useful is to understand the difference between thinking ontologically which is thinking in terms of the contact zone, where there are factors that relate to one another, that create meaning in the ontic zone, in the material realm. I think that having a deep understanding of that distinction and difference opens the world up in a way, in a very useful way. But to understand those ideas means going a little bit beyond the general expectation about work, to trying to understand something fundamentally useful about what it means to think, to really think. And so what the only thing I can really suggest is to learn to love to think. There are so many ways in which we are swept up in opinion and ideology, and that passes for a kind of version of thought, but it's not thought at all. It's a kind of superficial way of relating to one another. And so I think, yeah, in the end, what grounds the things that we think? That's a good place to start with any project. And I think that whatever the specifics around that project is, if you're really thinking about that distinction between the ground and the material, it's going to really open up how you can really think about the material that you work with.
Thank you for sharing that. I like that, thinking about what grounds the things that we think, and then going through the differences between, like, and connecting that to the content. I think that is a really important process, and one that maybe sometimes we do without thinking and so we need to stop and pause ourselves and really think through that more. A good, thinking, like what you're saying, really loving to think through all the different factors, what our own assumptions and beliefs are, as well as how that may inform how we view content, or how we share content, or how we what we decide to do with the content that we have. And so thank you for sharing that piece of advice.